Shadow Creek wasn't supposed to be more than a brief stop on her journey. A forgotten desert town tucked away beneath towering red rocks and endless sky. But for Rachel Morrison, a former Navy SEAL still haunted by the shadows of her past, Shadow Creek becomes the battleground she never saw coming. When a chance encounter at a gas station places her squarely in the crosshairs of the Desert Wolves, ruthless biker gang with a grip on the town, Rachel quickly learns that their petty intimidation is only the surface of a far darker operation. Beneath the dusty streets and quiet facades lies a web of corruption, trafficking, and fear, all orchestrated by a figure from Rachel's own past, the Surgeon. Once a shadowy mastermind behind devastating operations that left Rachel's team shattered, the Surgeon is now running an empire of human suffering, with Shadow Creek as his latest prize. But the cartel didn't count on one thing: Rachel's relentless pursuit of justice. With the help of a determined deputy, a group of unlikely allies, and a town desperate to take back its soul, Rachel launches a high-stakes mission to dismantle the cartel's operation piece by piece. Yet the deeper she digs, the more dangerous the game becomes. Old betrayals resurface, lives hang in the balance, and the line between justice and vengeance begins to blur. In the fight for Shadow Creek, Rachel faces a question she's avoided for years. How far will she go to confront the past and protect those who can't protect themselves? The town is about to learn that beneath the calm demeanor of a lone rider lies the spirit of an elite warrior. The cartel may thrive in shadows, but Rachel Morrison is about to bring them into the light. What begins as a small town stand against injustice spirals into a relentless battle of wits, weapons, and willpower. Lives will be saved. Empires will fall. And Rachel will stop at nothing to ensure that Shadow Creek is not just another casualty in the cartel's reign of terror. From here, the story unfolds with high-stakes action, unexpected alliances, and a clash of two forces destined to collide. How will Rachel outmaneuver an enemy that knows her every move? And how much is she willing to sacrifice for justice? The answers lie deep in the shadows of Shadow Creek. The desert stretched endlessly under the burning Arizona sun, its heat shimmering off the asphalt of Highway 87. Rachel Morrison leaned forward on her Kawasaki Ninja, her mind quieter than it had been in weeks. 15 years in the Navy, most of them spent as a SEAL, had taught her how to compartmentalize her emotions. But no amount of training could erase the memories of Guatemala or the lives lost on that ill-fated mission. Shadow Creek appeared like a mirage, a small town carved out of red rock and sand. Rachel wasn't looking for trouble, just a tank of gas and a chance to gather her thoughts before continuing on. She wasn't expecting Shadow Creek to be anything more than another nameless on her map. As she rolled into Johnson's gas station, the first thing she noticed was the silence. The kind of silence that carried weight, like the town itself was holding its breath. She scanned her surroundings instinctively: two dusty pickups by the storefront, a security camera that had long since stopped working, and the faint scent of engine oil in the air. Joe Johnson, the station's owner, watched her from the window. His weathered face betrayed a lifetime of hard-earned wisdom. Rachel parked her bike by the pumps, her eyes meeting his briefly. Something in his expression told her he saw more than just a lone rider. Rachel removed her helmet, shaking out her dark, shoulder-length hair, and adjusted her leather jacket to conceal the SEAL trident tattoo on her forearm. As she walked toward the store, she felt the faint stirrings of unease. "Long way from anywhere, ma'am," Johnson said as she entered, his voice gruff but not unkind. "Just passing through," Rachel replied, her tone measured. She selected a coffee cup from the counter, her fingers brushing over the scar on her right hand. A souvenir from Kandahar. Before Johnson could respond, the low rumble of motorcycles shattered the quiet. Rachel turned, watching as 3 bikes roared into the lot, their engines deliberately loud enough to rattle the windows. The riders wore leather cuts emblazoned with a snarling wolf's head. The Desert Wolves. Rachel had seen their type before. Swaggering bullies who thrived on intimidation. The lead rider, a man with a scarred face and a cruel smile, dismounted first. Marcus Blade Rodriguez. Rachel knew the name before Johnson had time to whisper it. Dishonorably discharged from the Marines, Blade had carved out a reputation as a local enforcer for the cartel. Blade sauntered into the store, his lieutenants flanking him. The air grew heavy as their boots thudded against the worn linoleum. Johnson's hand trembled slightly as he set down the coffee pot. "Sheriff Cooper says you missed this month's meeting," Blade said, his voice carrying an edge that made the room feel colder. "He's concerned about your commitment to the community." "I've been busy," Johnson replied, his voice steadying. "You know how it is." Blade's smile didn't reach his eyes. Sure. But when the sheriff calls a meeting, it's not optional." Rachel watched silently, cataloging details with practiced precision. Blade's stance, the knife in his boot, the chemical smell clinging to his clothes. It all painted a picture. These men weren't just muscle. They were part of something larger, something that reeked of meth labs and human trafficking. "Maybe the sheriff should focus on actual law enforcement," Johnson said, his voice stronger now, "instead of running errands for thugs." The store went dead silent. Blade's smile vanished, replaced by a snarl. "What did you just say to me, old man?" Rachel was already moving. As Snake, one of Blade's men, reached for his knife, she stepped between him and Johnson, her hand clamping down on Blade's wrist. Precise pressure on a nerve cluster forced him to drop the coffee pot he'd picked up. "He said the sheriff should do his job," Rachel said, her voice calm but carrying an authority that froze the room. Blade's gaze shifted to her, his bravado faltering. "Who the hell are you?" Rachel smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Someone who's seen enough bullies for one lifetime." Snake and the other lieutenant, Tank, hesitated, their hands hovering near their weapons. "I wouldn't," Rachel said, her tone sharp. "Your draws are slow, and you telegraph your intentions like amateurs. By the time you clear leather, this'll be over." "You have no idea who you're messing with," Blade snarled, trying to pull away. "Actually, I do," Rachel replied. "Marcus Rodriguez. Dishonorable discharge. The Desert Wolves run protection rackets across 3 counties, but lately, you've moved up to something bigger. Those chemical burns on Snake's hands aren't from cooking meth, are they?" The color drained from Blade's face. Tank's hand twitched toward his pistol, but Rachel tightened her grip on Blade's wrist, making him gasp. "Here's what happens next," she said. "You and your friends leave. We forget this happened. Or we find out just how many bones I can break before you hit the floor. Your choice." For a long moment, nobody moved. Then Blade raised his free hand in surrender. "All right, we're leaving. But this isn't over." Rachel released him, stepping back. "It can be. That's up to you." The bikers backed away, their attempts to look menacing undermined by the way Blade cradled his wrist. As they mounted their bikes, he shot one last glare through the window before they roared away into the desert. Johnson exhaled slowly. "Who are you?" Rachel sat back down, taking a sip of her now-cold coffee. "Just someone passing through." But as she watched the bikers disappear into the shimmering heat, Rachel knew it wasn't over. Blade's words weren't an empty threat, and Shadow Creek was hiding more than it seemed. The sun hung low over Shadow Creek, casting long shadows across the red rocks as Rachel parked her motorcycle behind Maria's diner. It was the kind of place that felt frozen in time, the neon sign buzzing faintly above the door. Inside, the smell of coffee and grilled food mingled with the soft hum of conversation. Rachel sat at a corner booth, her back to the wall, her eyes scanning the room. Deputy Sarah Martinez slid into the seat across from her, setting down a manila folder that looked worn from being handled too many times. "Thanks for meeting me," Martinez said, her voice low. "I didn't know who else to trust." Rachel nodded, her expression unreadable. "What's in the file?" Martinez hesitated before opening it. Inside were photos, documents, and hand-drawn maps of the area around the copper mine. Proof that the Desert Wolves are more than just a biker gang. They're running a trafficking operation out of the old mine. Drugs, weapons, and people. Sheriff Cooper's been covering for them, making sure no one asks too many questions. Rachel studied the photos, images of shipping containers parked near the mine entrance, men armed with rifles standing guard, and tire tracks leading to hidden entrances. "You've been tracking this alone?" Rachel asked. Martinez nodded. "I've tried to get help, but everyone's either on Cooper's payroll or too scared to cross him. I can't do this by myself. But after what you did at the gas station, I figured you might be willing to help." Before Rachel could respond, The bell over the diner door chimed. Marcus Blade Rodriguez entered, flanked by Snake and Tank. They scanned the room, their eyes landing on Rachel and Martinez. Blade's smile was a sharp, predatory thing. "Small town," he said, sauntering over. "Guess it's true what they say. Everyone knows everyone's business." Rachel leaned back, her gaze steady. "What do you want?" Blade chuckled. "Oh, nothing. Just came by to see if the new face in town was settling in." He glanced at Martinez. "And to remind the deputy here that sticking her nose where it doesn't belong can be dangerous." Martinez stiffened, but Rachel remained calm. "You've got a lot of nerve, walking in here after what happened at the gas station." Blade leaned on the edge of their table, his face inches from Rachel's. "And you've got a lot of nerve thinking you can scare me." Rachel's voice was ice. "I don't need to scare you, Blade. You're already scared. That's why you brought backup." Blade's smile faltered for just a moment, but it was enough. Rachel's gaze flicked to Snake and Tank, noting their weapons and stances. They were trying too hard to look relaxed, their hands hovering near their sides. "Get out," Martinez said, her voice steady despite the tension. Blade straightened, his smile returning. "You should listen to her, Rachel. Shadow Creek's not your problem." Rachel didn't flinch. "It is now." Blade's expression darkened. Without another word, he turned and left, his men following close behind. The diner grew quieter as the sound of their motorcycles faded into the distance. Maria Ramirez, the diner's owner, appeared with a fresh pot of coffee. "You just made yourself a target," she said, pouring Rachel a cup. "Wouldn't be the first time," Rachel replied, taking a sip. Maria hesitated, glancing at Martinez. "The wolves don't just take orders from Cooper. They're connected to something bigger. Everyone in town knows it, but no one's brave enough to say it." Rachel leaned forward. "Tell me everything you know." Maria sighed. "A few months ago, the mine was abandoned. Then the desert wolves started showing up with trucks, containers, and armed guards. Rumors started about people disappearing, mostly young women from nearby towns. The wolves aren't smart enough to run something like that on their own. Someone else is pulling the strings." Martinez nodded. "She's right. The wolves are just the muscle. The real power belongs to someone higher up, a man they call the surgeon." Rachel's eyes narrowed. The name triggered a flood of memories from Guatemala. The surgeon had been the shadowy figure behind the mission that cost Rachel her team. "Do you have any proof he's here?" Rachel asked. Martinez shook her head. "Not yet, but I know the wolves are meeting with someone tomorrow night at the mine. If we can get close enough, we might be able to confirm it." Rachel's mind raced. The situation was more complex than she'd anticipated. The wolves were dangerous, but if the surgeon was involved, this wasn't just a local problem. It was a link in a much larger chain. "I'll help," Rachel said finally, "but we do this my way." That night, Rachel and Martinez met with Joe Johnson in the back office of the gas station. Johnson spread out a map of Shadow Creek and the surrounding area, his finger tracing the old Prohibition tunnels that snaked beneath the town. "These tunnels were used to smuggle booze back in the day," Johnson explained. "Most people have forgotten about them, but they're still intact. If the wolves are using the mine for their operations, these tunnels might be our way in." Rachel studied the map. "Can we access the mine from here?" Johnson nodded. "There's an entrance behind the diner. It's risky, but it'll get you close without being seen." Rachel glanced at Martinez. "How much do you trust him?" "With my life," Martinez replied without hesitation. Johnson smirked. "You Navy types always think you're the only ones who've seen action. I've got 20 years as a pararescueman. Trust me, I can handle myself." Rachel gave him a small nod. "Then let's gear up. Tomorrow night, we find out exactly what the wolves are hiding." The following evening, the three of them moved through the tunnels, their flashlights casting narrow beams in the darkness. The air was damp and smelled of earth, the silence broken only by the sound of their footsteps. Rachel led the way, her senses heightened. She'd memorized the map, knowing exactly where they needed to go. As they neared the mine, the sound of voices and machinery echoed through the tunnels. Rachel motioned for them to stop. She crept forward, peering through a crack in the tunnel wall. The mine's interior was a hive of activity. Men loading crates into trucks, guards patrolling with rifles, and Blades standing near a figure in a tailored suit. The surgeon. Rachel's breath caught in her throat. After all these years, the man responsible for her team's deaths was standing just a few yards away. "We've got confirmation," she whispered, her voice tight with anger. Martinez leaned closer, her eyes narrowing as she studied the scene. "What now?" Rachel's jaw tightened. "We get out of here and come back with a plan. This isn't over." The desert sky was painted in shades of crimson and gold as the sun sank behind the jagged peaks of Shadow Creek. Rachel stood at the edge of the gas station's rooftop, her eyes fixed on the horizon but her thoughts far from the present. The surgeon's face lingered in her mind, dredging up memories she'd spent years trying to bury. "Hey." Rachel turned to see Joe Johnson climbing up the ladder, a thermos of coffee in one hand. He handed it to her without a word and sat down on the ledge, his legs dangling over the side. "Not much of a sunset watcher," Johnson said, taking a sip from his own cup. "But I figured you could use the company." Rachel nodded, appreciating the gesture but unsure how to respond. The silence stretched between them until Johnson broke it. "You've seen him before, haven't you?" Rachel's jaw tightened. "Guatemala." Johnson nodded slowly, not pressing her to elaborate. But the word alone brought it all back. The humid air thick with the stench of death, the screams of her teammates as the ambush unfolded, and the surgeon's voice over the radio, calm and detached as he ordered the compound's destruction. "We were sent to intercept a high-value target," Rachel said finally, her voice low. "Intel said it was a small cartel operation smuggling drugs across the border. Routine extraction. But when we got there..." Her words faltered, and Johnson waited patiently. "It was a trap," she continued. "The surgeon was running a human trafficking ring. We found women, dozens of them, chained in the basement of the compound. We tried to get them out, but the surgeon had already planned for us. Explosives rigged to collapse the building. He watched it happen, Johnson. He made sure we heard his voice as the walls came down." Johnson's face darkened. "How did you survive?" Rachel stared at her hands, flexing them as if feeling the weight of the rubble. "I don't know. I was thrown clear when the explosives went off. The rest of my team," she trailed off, the words too painful to say aloud. Johnson set his coffee down. "And now he's here, running the same game in Shadow Creek." Rachel nodded. "He doesn't just kill people. He breaks them. He turns them into currency, something to trade or sell. I've spent every day since Guatemala wondering what I could have done differently, how I could have stopped him." Johnson's voice was firm. "You've got a second chance now. We all do." Rachel looked at him, her resolve hardening. "I'm not going to waste it." That night, Rachel joined Martinez in her small office at the sheriff's department. The room was dimly lit, the walls lined with outdated equipment and dusty file cabinets. Martinez spread out a series of maps and photos on the desk. "I've been digging through old property records," Martinez said, pointing to a map of the copper mine and surrounding areas. "The mine itself is just the tip of the iceberg. There's an entire network of tunnels running beneath Shadow Creek, old smuggling routes from the Prohibition era." Rachel leaned over the map, tracing the paths with her finger. "These could give us access to the mine without them knowing." "That's the plan," Martinez said. "But we'll need to move fast. Blade's men are getting restless. If the surgeon decides to accelerate his operation, we could lose our window." Rachel studied the photos Martinez had gathered, images of young women who had gone missing over the past year, all from nearby towns. She recognized the look in their eyes. Fear and desperation mixed with the faint hope that someone would come for them. "We can't let them disappear," Rachel said, her voice steady. "We hit them hard, take the surgeon out, and dismantle his operation before he has a chance to regroup." Martinez hesitated. "There's one more thing you need to know. The surgeon has a security chief, a guy named Victor. Ex-military, highly trained. Does that name mean anything to you?" Rachel froze. Victor. The name hit her like a punch to the gut. "I know him," Rachel said, her voice tight. "He was on our team in Guatemala. We thought he died in the ambush." Martinez frowned. "You think he switched sides?" Rachel nodded. "It's the only thing that makes sense. He was always good, too good. He must have been feeding intel to the surgeon the whole time." Martinez's expression hardened. "If he's here, That changes everything. It means they're expecting us, Rachel said grimly. We'll need to stay one step ahead. The next day, Rachel and Martinez met with Johnson in the diner's back room. Maria joined them, carrying a faded notebook filled with notes and diagrams. My husband was a mining engineer, Maria explained. Before he passed, he mapped out the entire tunnel system beneath the town. It's not perfect, but it should help you find your way. Rachel flipped through the notebook, impressed by the level of detail. This is exactly what we need. Maria hesitated before speaking again. There's something else. My nephew, Carlos, works maintenance at the mine. He started 2 days ago. He doesn't know everything, but he's been keeping his eyes open. If you need someone on the inside, he can help. Rachel nodded. Tell him to stay low and report anything unusual. The less they suspect him, the better. Johnson tapped the map with his finger. We've got our entry point, our intel, and our plan. Now we just need the timing. We move tomorrow night, Rachel said. Under cover of darkness. We'll scout the area first, confirm their movements, and then hit them hard. Maria's hand tightened on the edge of the table. Be careful, she said, her voice trembling slightly. The wolves might be thugs, but the surgeon, he's something else. Rachel met her gaze. I know. That's why we're going to stop him. As night fell, Rachel found herself alone in the diner, the others busy preparing for the mission. She sat in the dimly lit room, the weight of the past pressing down on her. She pulled a small photo from her pocket, a picture of her SEAL team from Guatemala. They were smiling, their arms slung over each other's shoulders, oblivious to the tragedy that awaited them. I won't let it happen again, Rachel whispered, her voice barely audible. Her phone buzzed, pulling her back to the present. It was Martinez. Blade and his men are on the move, Martinez said. They're heading to the mine. Looks like they're gearing up for something big. Rachel's grip tightened on her phone. Then we stick to the plan. Tomorrow, we take the fight to them. As she stepped out into the cool desert night, Rachel felt a sense of clarity. The shadows of her past were still there, but for the first time in years, she wasn't running from them. She was running toward them. The tunnels beneath Shadow Creek were darker than Rachel had anticipated, the air thick with dampness and the metallic tang of earth. Her flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the walls that had once smuggled bootleg liquor. Now, they were about to be used for something far more dangerous. Behind her, Joe Johnson and Deputy Martinez followed closely, their movements careful and precise. Rachel led them silently, her mind focused on the mission ahead. The plan was simple. Infiltrate the copper mine through the Prohibition tunnels, gather intel on the cartel's operations, and locate the captives held in the cathedral. But as a seasoned operator, Rachel knew that no mission ever went exactly as planned. They reached a narrow junction where the tunnel split into 2 paths. Rachel studied the map Maria had provided, her brow furrowed. This way, she whispered, gesturing to the left. As they moved, the faint sound of voices reached them, bouncing off the tunnel walls. Rachel held up a fist, signaling them to stop. She crouched low and crept forward, her movements silent and controlled. Through a crack in the wall, she saw 2 cartel guards standing near a metal gate. One was leaning against the wall, his rifle slung lazily over his shoulder, while the other paced back and forth, smoking a cigarette. Rachel motioned for Johnson and Martinez to stay back. She slipped closer, her hand instinctively tightening around the hilt of her knife. With practiced precision, she neutralized the first guard, pulling him into the shadows before the second even noticed. By the time the other guard turned, her blade was already at his throat. Don't make a sound, she whispered, her voice cold and steady. The guard froze, his eyes wide with terror. Rachel motioned for Johnson to join her. Take his comms, she instructed. We'll need them to monitor their chatter. Johnson complied, removing the man's earpiece and radio before securing him with zip ties. Clear, Rachel whispered. Martinez joined them, her eyes darting nervously. We're close to the main chamber, she said, glancing at the map. The cathedral should be just ahead. Rachel nodded, her focus unwavering. But as they moved deeper into the tunnels, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The cathedral was aptly named. The massive underground chamber stretched high above them, its walls lined with industrial lights that cast eerie shadows. Shipping containers were stacked along the edges, guarded by heavily armed men. Rachel scanned the area, her heart tightening as she spotted movement inside one of the containers. Through the small, grated window, she saw a young woman's face, pale, terrified, and staring blankly ahead. "We've found them," Rachel said, her voice a mix of relief and anger. "Martinez, get photos. We need evidence." Martinez nodded, raising a small camera and snapping shots of the containers, the guards, and the captives. Rachel keyed her earpiece. "Johnson, how's the back route looking?" "Clear," Johnson replied from his position near an alternate tunnel entrance. "We'll have a clean extraction once we secure the captives." Rachel studied the guards, mapping out their patrol routes and identifying weak points. It wasn't perfect, but they had a chance if they moved quickly and decisively. "On my signal," Rachel said. But before she could give the order, a faint crackle came through the guard's stolen radio. "Team Bravo, report status." "Over." Rachel froze, her instincts flaring. Something wasn't right. As they retreated to plan their assault, Rachel noticed Johnson lingering near the tunnel's edge, his posture tense. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice low. Johnson hesitated, his eyes darting away. "Nothing. Just making sure we're not being followed." Rachel didn't buy it. She stepped closer, her gaze piercing. "What aren't you telling me?" Before Johnson could answer, the stolen radio crackled to life again. This time, the voice on the other end was unmistakable. "Commander Morrison," the surgeon's voice drawled, smooth and mocking. "I hope you're enjoying the view." Rachel's blood ran cold. She grabbed the radio, her grip tight. "How do you know I'm here?" The surgeon chuckled. "Did you think I wouldn't recognize your handiwork? You may have changed your tactics, but you're still predictable, Rachel." Rachel's mind raced. If the surgeon knew their location, it could only mean one thing. She turned to Johnson, her voice deadly. "You've been feeding him intel." Johnson's face fell, guilt and fear flashing in his eyes. "Rachel, I didn't have a choice. They've got my family. If I didn't cooperate..." Rachel cut him off. "You put all of us at risk. Do you have any idea what you've done?" "I'm sorry," Johnson said, his voice cracking. "I didn't tell them everything. I swear. Just enough to keep them off my back." "Not enough," Rachel snapped. "He knew we were coming." Martinez stepped forward, her hand on her holstered weapon. "We should have seen this coming. The question is, what do we do now?" Rachel took a deep breath, forcing herself to think. Johnson had betrayed them, but they couldn't afford to lose him now. "We don't have time for this," Rachel said. "Johnson, if you want to make this right, you're coming with us. But if you so much as flinch the wrong way, I'll end this myself." Johnson nodded, his face pale. "I'll prove myself. I swear." With their position compromised, Rachel adjusted the plan. They would hit fast and hard, using the element of surprise to their advantage. The team moved back to the cathedral, this time with a clear objective. Martinez and Johnson would create a diversion near the main entrance, drawing the guards away while Rachel secured the captives. "Ready?" Rachel asked, her voice steady despite the tension. "Let's do this," Martinez replied. The operation unfolded with precision. Martinez and Johnson used smoke grenades to create chaos, forcing the guards into defensive positions. Rachel slipped through the confusion, her movements swift and silent. She reached the first container, prying the lock open with a crowbar. Inside, a group of young women stared at her in stunned silence. "You're safe now," Rachel said, her voice gentle but firm. "Follow me. Stay low." One by one, she led them to the tunnel entrance, where Martinez was waiting. The process was agonizingly slow, each second stretching into an eternity. But as the last captive was freed, a gunshot rang out, echoing through the chamber. Rachel spun around to see Blade emerging from the smoke, his gun trained on her. "Game's over, sweetheart," he sneered. Rachel didn't hesitate. She lunged forward, disarming him with a swift strike to his wrist. The gun clattered to the ground as Blade swung wildly, his movements clumsy and uncoordinated. Rachel ducked under his attack, delivering a brutal kick to his knee. Blade crumpled to the ground, groaning in pain. It's over when I say it's over, Rachel said, her voice cold. She secured him with zip ties before joining Martinez and the captives in the tunnel. As they emerged into the cool night air, Rachel felt a mix of relief and fury. The captives were safe, but the operation had been compromised, and the surgeon was still out there. You made the right call, Martinez said as they loaded the captives into waiting vehicles. Rachel didn't respond. Her mind was already racing ahead, planning their next move. Johnson approached hesitantly. I'll earn back your trust, he said. Rachel's expression was hard. You'll have to, because this isn't over. In the distance, the mine's lights still glowed, a stark reminder of the battles yet to come. The desert night was cold and quiet, but Rachel Morrison's mind was anything but. Standing on a ridge overlooking the copper mine, she watched through a pair of high-powered binoculars as the cartel's operation came to life. Trucks rumbled in and out of the compound, their headlights slicing through the darkness. Armed guards patrolled the perimeter, their rifles gleaming under the industrial floodlights. Next to Rachel, Deputy Martinez crouched low, her eyes fixed on the same scene. They're ramping up, Martinez whispered. We've never seen this much activity before. Rachel nodded. The surgeon's here. He's accelerating the timeline. In the distance, the low growl of engines echoed across the valley. Rachel adjusted her binoculars, focusing on the approaching convoy of black SUVs. Each vehicle moved in perfect formation, surrounded by a protective ring of motorcyclists, members of the Desert Wolves. Is that him? Martinez asked. Rachel's jaw tightened. It's him. The convoy rolled to a stop near the mine's entrance. Men poured out of the SUVs, their movements disciplined and methodical. At the center of it all stood the surgeon. His tailored suit was immaculate, his demeanor calm and collected. Even from this distance, Rachel could feel the weight of his presence. We have to move now, Martinez urged. If he's here, this might be our only chance to take him out. Rachel shook her head. Not yet. We're not ready. But Rachel turned to her, her voice firm. If we rush in now, we lose. He'll be expecting an attack. We need to hit him where he's weakest, not when he's at full strength. Martinez nodded reluctantly, trusting Rachel's judgment despite her growing frustration. Back at the gas station, the team regrouped in the dimly lit back office. Joe Johnson spread a map of the mine and surrounding tunnels across the table, his finger tracing the routes they'd scouted earlier. The tunnels give us access to the lower levels, Johnson explained. But the main chamber, the cathedral, is heavily guarded. If we want to reach it without getting spotted, we'll need a distraction. Rachel leaned over the map, her mind working through the possibilities. We'll divide into two teams. Martinez and Johnson, you'll create chaos at the surface, something loud enough to pull their attention away from the cathedral. I'll lead the infiltration team into the tunnels. Who's your team? Martinez asked. Rachel hesitated. She knew she needed someone she could trust completely. Johnson had betrayed them once, but he'd proven his loyalty since. Martinez had been steady, but this mission required more than just courage. It required precision. I'll take Carlos, Rachel said finally. He knows the layout better than anyone, and if we're lucky, they won't suspect him. Martinez frowned. You're putting a lot on him. Rachel met her gaze. We don't have a choice. If this goes wrong, none of us are walking out of there. The next evening, under the cover of darkness, Rachel and Carlos slipped into the tunnels. Carlos, Maria's nephew, was young, barely in his 20s, but his eyes held a quiet determination that reminded Rachel of her younger self. You sure you're ready for this? Rachel asked as they moved through the narrow passageways. Carlos nodded. I've seen what they do to people. My cousin was one of them. I'm not letting it happen to anyone else. Rachel respected his resolve, but kept her guard up. One misstep could cost them everything. At the surface, Martinez and Johnson positioned themselves near the mine's northern entrance. They had rigged a series of smoke bombs and crude explosives designed to mimic a larger attack. Are you sure this'll work? Martinez asked as Johnson lit the first fuse. Not at all, Johnson replied with a grim smile. But it'll buy them time. The explosion shattered the silence, sending plumes of smoke and fire into the air. Guards shouted orders, scrambling to respond. Martinez fired a few warning shots, adding to the chaos. Inside the mine, Rachel heard the commotion and quickened her pace. "They're taking the bait," Carlos whispered. "Good," Rachel replied. "Stay close." The cathedral was even more imposing up close. The cavernous chamber echoed with the sound of machinery and muffled voices. Guards patrolled the perimeter, their movements sharp and calculated. Rachel and Carlos ducked behind a stack of crates, waiting for an opening. Through the gaps, Rachel spotted the surgeon near the center of the chamber, speaking with Victor. Her breath caught. Victor, her former teammate turned traitor. His presence added another layer of complexity to an already impossible mission. "We need to get closer," Rachel whispered. Carlos nodded, leading her through a series of narrow passageways that brought them within earshot of the surgeon and Victor. "The shipment leaves in 48 hours, Victor said, his tone clipped. "We can't afford any delays." The surgeon's voice was calm but firm. "Make sure it's secure. I don't want another incident like Guatemala." Rachel's stomach churned. Guatemala. The memory of that mission, the ambush, the screams, the loss, came rushing back. Carlos glanced at her, concern flickering in his eyes. "You okay?" Rachel forced herself to focus. "Fine. Let's move." The team's plan began to unravel when a guard stumbled upon Martinez and Johnson's position. Shots rang out, the sound reverberating through the tunnels. Rachel cursed under her breath. "They're onto us." Carlos hesitated. "What do we do?" Rachel's mind raced. They couldn't leave without securing the captives, but the clock was ticking. "We stick to the plan," Rachel said, her voice steady. "But we'll need to move faster." As they approached the containers, Rachel spotted a group of young women huddled inside. Their faces were pale, their eyes hollow with fear. Rachel picked the lock with practiced ease, pulling the door open. "You're safe now," she said, her voice gentle. "Follow us." The women hesitated, their fear paralyzing them. "We don't have time for this," Carlos urged. Rachel knelt in front of the nearest girl, meeting her gaze. "Listen to me. You're stronger than they think, stronger than they want you to believe. But you have to move now." The girl nodded slowly, stepping forward. The others followed, their courage bolstered by her resolve. As they made their way back through the tunnels, Rachel heard footsteps behind them, heavy, deliberate. "Go," she told Carlos, handing him her sidearm. "Get them out of here." "What about you?" Carlos asked, his voice shaking. "I'll hold them off," Rachel said. Before he could protest, Rachel turned and moved toward the approaching footsteps. Victor emerged from the shadows, his rifle trained on her. "Commander Morrison," he said, his voice laced with mockery. "I knew you'd come." Rachel raised her hands, her expression calm despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. "You've been busy, Victor." "So have you," he replied. "But this is where it ends." Rachel's eyes narrowed. "For one of us." Victor's rifle stayed trained on Rachel as the dim tunnel lights flickered above them, their buzz the only sound breaking the oppressive silence. His face, illuminated in sharp shadows, was both familiar and alien. Gone was the camaraderie Rachel remembered from their SEAL days, replaced by a cold detachment. "You're not surprised to see me," Rachel said, her tone steady. Victor smirked. "The dead don't stay buried, Commander. I thought you'd learned that in Guatemala." Rachel's stomach twisted at the mention of the mission that had cost her everything. She didn't flinch, refusing to give Victor the satisfaction. "You betrayed us," she said, her voice tight with restrained anger. "You sold us out to him." Victor didn't deny it. Instead, he slung his rifle over his shoulder, pacing slowly. "Do you know what it's like, Morrison? To be expendable? To give your life to a system that throws you away the moment you're inconvenient? You had a choice." Rachel's voice hardened. "You chose him." Victor's smile faded. It wasn't about choosing him. It was about survival. Rachel moved cautiously, her eyes flicking between Victor's weapon and his stance. She needed to keep him talking, to buy time for Carlos and the captives to escape. "What does he have on you?" Rachel asked. Victor chuckled darkly. "Nothing anymore. At first, it was leverage, a family I thought I could protect. But they're gone now, Morrison. The surgeon made sure of that. Now, I work for him because there's nothing left to lose. Rachel's grip on her weapon tightened. You're wrong. There's always a choice. And you've been making the wrong one every step of the way. Victor's expression flickered, a crack in his otherwise stoic mask. That's the difference between us, Rachel continued. I don't let the past dictate who I am. You've let him own you. Victor raised his rifle again, his eyes narrowing. And you've let revenge blind you. You think you're here for justice, but we both know it's personal. Rachel shifted her weight subtly, preparing to move. Maybe it is, but at least I'm fighting for something that matters. Their standoff ended abruptly when the distant echo of gunfire reached them. Victor turned his head slightly, his grip on the rifle faltering for just a moment. It was all Rachel needed. She lunged forward, knocking the rifle from his hands and delivering a sharp elbow to his jaw. Victor staggered but recovered quickly, swinging a punch that Rachel narrowly dodged. The fight was brutal and efficient. Years of training boiled down to instinct. They moved like two predators circling each other, their strikes precise and calculated. You can't win this, Victor growled, swinging a heavy kick that Rachel blocked. This isn't about winning, Rachel shot back, driving her knee into his ribs. It's about doing what's right. Victor stumbled, coughing as he tried to catch his breath. Rachel advanced, pinning him against the wall. This is your chance, she said, her voice low but firm. Help me bring him down. End this cycle. Victor laughed bitterly. You think taking him out will change anything? The surgeon is just one piece of a much bigger machine. Then we'll dismantle the whole damn thing, Rachel said. Victor's gaze held hers for a long moment. Then, to her surprise, he smiled. A small, broken thing. You haven't changed, he said quietly. Still stubborn as hell. Rachel eased her grip slightly, wary of a trick. Are you in or out? Victor exhaled sharply, his shoulders slumping. Fine, but if this goes south, it's on you. They moved quickly, retracing Rachel's steps to where Carlos and the captives were waiting. Martinez's voice crackled over Rachel's earpiece. We've got movement topside, Martinez said. Reinforcements heading your way. How many? Rachel asked. Too many. You need to get out now. Rachel turned to Victor. How do we get them out without being spotted? Victor hesitated, then pointed to a side tunnel. This leads to an old ventilation shaft. It's tight, but it'll take you outside the perimeter. Rachel nodded, signaling for Carlos and the captives to follow. Martinez, meet us at the extraction point, Rachel said. On my way, Martinez replied. The group moved quickly through the narrow tunnel, their footsteps muffled on the damp ground. Rachel brought up the rear, her senses on high alert. You trust him? Carlos whispered, nodding toward Victor. I don't have a choice, Rachel said. The tension was palpable as they reached the ventilation shaft. Victor climbed up first, helping the captives one by one as Rachel and Carlos kept watch. As the last captive disappeared through the shaft, the sound of voices and footsteps grew louder behind them. They're coming, Carlos said, panic creeping into his voice. Rachel grabbed his arm. Go. I'll hold them off. No, Carlos said firmly. Not this time. Rachel opened her mouth to argue, but Victor interrupted. We don't have time for this. Move. Together, they climbed through the shaft, emerging into the cool desert night. Martinez was waiting with a vehicle, her expression tense. They're right behind you, she said. Rachel helped the captives into the truck, her heart pounding as headlights appeared in the distance. As the truck roared to life, the cartel reinforcements closed in. Rachel and Victor stayed behind, covering the escape with suppressive fire. This was your plan? Victor shouted over the chaos. Improvisation, Rachel replied, reloading her weapon. Victor laughed despite the situation. Some things never change. The truck disappeared into the night, taking the captives to safety. Rachel and Victor retreated, ducking into another tunnel just as the cartel reinforcements arrived. Hours later, as dawn broke over the desert, Rachel and Victor regrouped with the others at a safe house on the outskirts of Shadow Creek. The captives were safe, but the cost of the mission weighed heavily on them all. This isn't over, Martinez said, her voice resolute. No, Rachel agreed, glancing at Victor. But now we've got someone who knows how to hit them where it hurts. Victor met her gaze, his expression unreadable. You'll get your shot at him, Morrison. Just don't forget, this is a war, not a battle. Rachel nodded, her determination unshaken. Then we fight it one battle at a time. The oppressive heat of the desert morning gave way to a biting chill as the sun dipped below the jagged peaks. Inside the safe house, Rachel stood over a table littered with maps, blueprints, and hastily scribbled notes. Her team, Martinez, Victor, Carlos, and Johnson, gathered around her, their faces illuminated by the dim light of a single overhead bulb. The cathedral is their stronghold, Rachel began, tapping a blueprint of the mine's interior. We know the surgeon's preparing to move his operation. If we don't act now, he'll vanish, and we'll lose our chance to shut this down for good. Martinez frowned. What about the captives we rescued? They said there are more people deeper in the mine. People the cartel plans to dispose of if things go south. Rachel's jaw tightened. That's why we're hitting them tonight. This isn't just about taking out the surgeon. It's about saving everyone he hasn't broken yet. Victor leaned against the wall, arms crossed. They'll be expecting us. After last night, their security will be doubled. Good, Rachel said. The more resources they put into defending the mine, the fewer they'll have elsewhere. Carlos hesitated. What if it's a trap? Rachel's gaze hardened. It probably is, but we don't have a choice. The operation was divided into 3 phases. Martinez and Johnson would lead a diversionary assault on the mine surface, drawing out the majority of the guards. Rachel, Victor, and Carlos would infiltrate the cathedral through the Prohibition tunnels, using Maria's map to navigate the labyrinth of passageways. Stick to the plan, Rachel said as they prepared to move out. No heroics. We do this fast, we do it clean, and we get everyone out alive. Victor smirked faintly. You always were a stickler for protocol. Rachel ignored him, her focus unyielding. Let's move. The tunnels were colder than Rachel remembered, the stale air laced with the metallic tang of damp earth. She led the way, her flashlight casting long shadows on the walls. Behind her, Carlos carried a pack of explosives, his hands trembling slightly. Victor brought up the rear, his movements silent and deliberate. As they neared the cathedral, the distant hum of machinery and muffled voices grew louder. Rachel motioned for the team to halt, her hand instinctively reaching for her weapon. Victor crouched beside her, his voice barely audible. How do you want to play this? We plant the charges first, Rachel said. Then we secure the captives. Once we're clear, Martinez and Johnson set off the diversion. Carlos swallowed hard. What if something goes wrong? Rachel glanced at him, her expression firm but not unkind. Then we adapt. The cathedral was even more massive than Rachel had imagined. The cavernous chamber was illuminated by industrial lights, their harsh glow reflecting off the walls. Rows of shipping containers lined the space, each guarded by heavily armed men. Rachel spotted the captives, dozens of them, huddled together in a makeshift pen. Their faces were pale, their eyes hollow with fear. There, she whispered. That's our target. Victor scanned the area, his sharp eyes noting every guard, every camera, every potential threat. We'll need a bigger distraction than planned. They're too fortified. Let's get to work, Rachel said, motioning for Carlos to follow. While Carlos set the charges along key support beams, Rachel and Victor worked to disable the guards. They moved like shadows, their actions swift and precise. Rachel took down the first guard with a knife to the throat, catching his body before it hit the ground. Victor dispatched another with a silenced pistol, his movements efficient and almost clinical. As they cleared a path to the captives, Rachel noticed a figure standing on an elevated platform. The surgeon. He was flanked by 2 guards, his posture relaxed as he oversaw the operation. Even from a distance, Rachel could feel the cold menace emanating from him. Target in sight, she whispered to Victor. Not yet, Victor replied. Focus on the captives. Carlos finished planting the charges and rejoined Rachel near the pen. The captives looked up as she approached, their fear momentarily replaced by a flicker of hope. We're here to get you out, Rachel said, her voice steady. Stay quiet and follow our lead. She motioned for Victor to cover them as she unlocked the gate. The captives moved hesitantly at first, their steps faltering as if they couldn't believe freedom was within reach. "Hurry," Rachel urged. Just as the last captive stepped out, an alarm blared. The guards snapped into action, their radios crackling with orders. "Martinez, we're compromised." Rachel barked into her earpiece. "Initiate the diversion." Above ground, Martinez and Johnson set off a series of explosions, sending plumes of smoke and fire into the night sky. Guards rushed to respond, leaving the cathedral undermanned. "Keep them busy," Martinez said, firing a burst of suppressive shots as Johnson reloaded. "Rachel needs time." In the chaos, Rachel led the captives through the tunnels, Victor and Carlos covering the rear. The charges were set, but the window for escape was closing fast. "We're running out of time," Carlos said, panic creeping into his voice. "We're almost there," Rachel replied, her tone firm. They reached the extraction point, where Martinez and Johnson were waiting with vehicles. "Get them out of here," Rachel ordered. "What about you?" Martinez asked. Rachel glanced back toward the cathedral. "I'm finishing this." Rachel and Victor returned to the chamber, where the surgeon stood calmly amidst the chaos. Guards scrambled to contain the situation, their movements frantic and disorganized. "It's over," Rachel said, stepping into the light. The surgeon turned, his expression unreadable. "Commander Morrison, I was wondering when you'd show yourself." Rachel leveled her weapon at him. "This ends now." The surgeon smirked. "You think you've won? Even if you kill me, the operation continues. You can't stop the inevitable." Victor moved to flank him, his weapon trained on the remaining guards. "You always did talk too much." The surgeon's composure faltered for the first time. "Victor, I should have known you'd betray me." Victor's jaw tightened. "You betrayed me first." The final confrontation was swift and brutal. Rachel and Victor fought side by side, their coordination honed by years of training. One by one, the guards fell, leaving the surgeon exposed. As Rachel advanced, he pulled a hidden blade from his sleeve, lunging at her with surprising speed. Rachel dodged, countering with a swift strike that sent the blade clattering to the ground. "It's over," she said, her voice cold. The surgeon laughed, blood staining his teeth. "You think you've won, but you'll never stop us all." Rachel didn't waver. "Maybe not, but I can stop you." As the charges detonated, the cathedral began to collapse, the walls shaking violently. Rachel and Victor made their escape, emerging into the cool night air as the ground rumbled beneath them. The surgeon was dead, his empire crumbling. But Rachel knew the fight was far from over. "Good work," Martinez said as the team regrouped. Rachel nodded, her gaze fixed on the horizon. This was just the beginning. The fiery glow of the collapsing cathedral lit the desert night as Rachel and her team regrouped near the extraction vehicles. Dust and smoke hung thick in the air, the echoes of detonations still rumbling beneath their feet. The captives were loaded into trucks, their hollow stares gradually softening into relief as the adrenaline of survival began to wear off. Rachel stood apart from the group, her weapon still in hand, scanning the dark horizon. Martinez approached, her face streaked with dirt and sweat. "They're safe," Martinez said, nodding toward the trucks. "We've got a head count. 36 captives, all accounted for." Rachel nodded but didn't relax. "Good. But we're not out of this yet." Behind them, Victor leaned against a truck, wrapping a bandage around a shallow cut on his forearm. His expression was grim. "She's right. The surgeon's death doesn't end this. They'll retaliate." Martinez frowned. "With what? Their operation just collapsed?" Victor shook his head. "You don't know how deep this goes. The surgeon wasn't the top of the chain. He answered to people with more power and resources than you can imagine." Rachel's jaw tightened. "Then we prepare. If they're coming, we'll meet them head-on." By the time the sun rose, Shadow Creek was teetering on the edge of chaos. The cartel's retribution was swift and brutal. Explosions rocked the town as cartel enforcers targeted key locations, businesses suspected of aiding Rachel's team, the sheriff's station, even Maria's diner. Rachel and her team worked tirelessly to evacuate civilians, guiding them to a makeshift shelter in the church basement. The sound of gunfire and shouting echoed through the streets as cartel forces swept through the town, their goal clear. Send a message. In the church basement, Maria paced nervously, wringing her hands. They're destroying everything, she said, her voice trembling. They'll burn this town to the ground. Rachel placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. We're not going to let that happen. We've got the advantage now. They don't know what we're planning. Maria nodded, her resolve hardening. What do you need from me? Keep the civilians calm and safe, Rachel said. And if you hear or see anything, let us know immediately. The safe house became the team's makeshift command center. Maps of the town were pinned to the walls, marked with red circles indicating cartel movements. Martinez coordinated with her remaining deputies, setting up roadblocks and diversionary traps to slow the enemy's advance. Victor, meanwhile, shared critical intel about the cartel structure. They'll send more reinforcements, he said. Private contractors, trained assassins. They won't stop until this town is ashes. Rachel leaned over the table, her eyes scanning the map. Then we hit them where it hurts. Their reinforcements will need a staging area. Any idea where that might be? Victor pointed to an abandoned warehouse on the edge of town. Here. It's remote, easy to defend, and large enough to store vehicles and supplies. Rachel nodded. Then that's where we strike next. Under cover of darkness, Rachel, Victor, and Martinez moved toward the warehouse. Carlos stayed behind with Johnson to secure the civilians and monitor communications. The warehouse loomed ahead, its broken windows glowing faintly with light from within. Rachel signaled for the team to halt, her eyes narrowing as she surveyed the perimeter. Guards on the south and east sides, she whispered. They're expecting trouble, but their patrol patterns are sloppy. Victor smirked. Amateurs. Martinez adjusted her rifle. Let's keep it that way. Quiet and clean. Rachel led the way, moving silently through the shadows. They took out the perimeter guards with precision, each takedown swift and silent. Inside, the warehouse was a hive of activity. Cartel enforcers and hired mercenaries moved among crates of weapons and supplies. Vehicles lined the walls, their engines idling as drivers prepared to deploy. Rachel's gaze fell on a table in the center of the room, where a group of men pored over a map of Shadow Creek. She recognized one of them, a cartel lieutenant she'd seen in the cathedral. Target acquired, she whispered into her earpiece. Victor nodded. We take him out, and their coordination falls apart. The team struck with surgical precision. Martinez covered the exits while Rachel and Victor advanced on the cartel lieutenant. The ensuing firefight was chaotic but brief, the element of surprise working in their favor. Rachel cornered the lieutenant, her weapon trained on him. Who's giving the orders now? She demanded. The man sneered, blood dripping from a cut on his lip. You think killing me will change anything? You're just delaying the inevitable. Rachel didn't flinch. Names. Locations. Now. The lieutenant hesitated, then laughed bitterly. You don't understand who you're dealing with, do you? The surgeon was nothing compared to the ones above him. Before Rachel could press further, a gunshot rang out. The lieutenant slumped forward, a bullet hole in his temple. Rachel spun around to see Victor lowering his weapon. He wasn't going to talk, Victor said, his voice flat. Rachel's eyes flashed with anger. That wasn't your call. Victor met her gaze without flinching. It was the right call. The team returned to the safe house to regroup, but tensions ran high. What the hell was that? Rachel demanded, her voice sharp. Victor shrugged. We're at war, Morrison. Sometimes you don't get the luxury of playing by the rules. We're not them, Rachel shot back. We do this right, or we don't do it at all. Martinez stepped between them, her expression weary. Enough. We don't have time for this. The cartel's not going to wait for us to sort out our differences. Rachel took a deep breath, forcing herself to focus. Fine, but this isn't over. The cartel's assault intensified as night fell. More explosions rocked the town, and reports of casualties began to trickle in. In the safe house, Rachel gathered the team for a final briefing. They're trying to break us, she said, but we're not going to give them that satisfaction. This is our town, and we're taking it back. Victor leaned against the wall, his expression unreadable. What's the plan? Rachel pointed to the map. We lure them into the center of town, where their numbers work against them. Martinez, set up sniper positions here and here. Carlos, I need you on comms, coordinating movements. Victor, you're with me. We're taking the fight to them. Victor smirked faintly, just like old times. Rachel didn't respond, her focus already on the battle ahead. As dawn approached, the cartel forces converged on Shadow Creek's main square. Rachel's team was ready, their positions fortified and their traps set. The first wave of attackers was met with a hail of gunfire and explosions. Rachel moved through the chaos like a ghost, her weapon precise and unrelenting. Victor covered her flank, his actions efficient and brutal. Despite their differences, they fought like a seamless unit, their years of training evident in every move. By the time the sun rose, the cartel forces were in full retreat. Shadow Creek lay battered but unbroken, its streets littered with the remnants of the battle. Rachel stood in the square, her weapon lowered, as the town began to stir. The fight wasn't over, not by a long shot, but for the first time, they'd shown the cartel that Shadow Creek wasn't theirs to take. "We did it," Martinez said, her voice filled with cautious relief. Rachel nodded, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "For now, but they'll be back." Victor stepped up beside her, his expression unreadable. "What happens next?" Rachel's jaw tightened. "We make sure they regret ever setting foot here." The sun climbed slowly over the jagged peaks of Shadow Creek, its rays piercing through the lingering smoke that hung over the town. The battlefield in the main square was eerily quiet, littered with shattered glass, burned-out vehicles, and the faint smell of cordite. Shadow Creek had survived, but the scars were fresh and deep. Rachel stood on the roof of the church, her binoculars sweeping the streets. She watched as civilians emerged cautiously from their hiding places, some offering hesitant waves of gratitude to Martinez and her deputies, who worked tirelessly to restore order. "They're regrouping," Victor's voice broke her focus. He climbed the ladder to join her, his expression grim. "How soon?" Rachel asked, not lowering her binoculars. "Hours. Maybe less," Victor replied. "We intercepted some cartel comms. They're bringing in reinforcements, real ones this time. Not street muscle, but professional operators." Rachel's jaw tightened. "They're doubling down." "They have to," Victor said, leaning against the railing. "If they don't, it sends a message to every small town they control that rebellion works. They can't afford that." Rachel lowered the binoculars, turning to face him. "Then we need to send a message of our own." Inside the church basement, the team gathered around a table cluttered with maps, radios, and ammunition. Maria stood off to the side, her hands clasped tightly as she listened. Rachel pointed to a marked location on the map, a cartel safe house outside of town. "We've identified this as their central hub. It's where they're coordinating reinforcements and storing supplies for their next assault. Taking it out would cripple their operation," Martinez said, nodding. "But it's going to be heavily defended. That's why we're hitting them with everything we've got," Rachel said. "Victor and I will lead the strike team. Martinez, you'll coordinate from here with Carlos and the deputies. Johnson will set up perimeter traps to cut off any escape routes." Maria stepped forward, her voice hesitant but determined. "What about the civilians? The people still hiding in their homes?" "We'll protect them," Rachel assured her. "This ends tonight." The strike team moved under the cover of darkness, their movements precise and silent. Victor led them through a series of back roads and trails, avoiding cartel patrols. By the time they reached the safe house, the air was heavy with tension. Rachel surveyed the building, a fortified structure surrounded by guards and vehicles. "Two teams," Rachel whispered. "Victor and I will breach the east side. The others take the west. Wait for my signal." Victor smirked faintly. "Still giving the orders, I see." Rachel didn't respond. Her focus was on the mission, every detail etched into her mind. The breach was explosive, literally. Rachel's team detonated charges on the east wall, creating a gaping hole that sent guards scrambling. Martinez's team struck simultaneously, catching the cartel forces in a deadly crossfire. The interior of the safe house was a chaotic maze of rooms and corridors, each one a potential death trap. Rachel moved swiftly, her weapon steady, clearing each space with practiced precision. Victor followed close behind, his movements methodical and efficient. Despite their differences, their training allowed them to function seamlessly as a unit. Back at the church, the atmosphere was tense but victorious. The operation had been a success, but the cost was heavy. Rachel stood before the team, her voice steady despite her exhaustion. "We've dealt them a serious blow, but this isn't the end. They'll regroup, and they'll come back stronger." Martinez nodded. "Then we hit them again." Rachel's gaze swept across the room, her eyes landing on Victor. "You've proven yourself tonight, but if you ever take another shot without my order, we're done. Clear?" Victor smirked faintly. "Crystal." In the early hours of the morning, Rachel stepped outside, the cool desert air a welcome relief. She stared at the horizon, the faint glow of dawn casting long shadows across the land. Victor joined her, his expression uncharacteristically somber. "You think this changes anything?" Rachel didn't look at him. "It changes everything for the people we saved tonight." "That's enough." Victor nodded, his gaze distant. "What about the people we couldn't save?" Rachel's voice was quiet but firm. "We keep fighting. For them, and for the ones still waiting." As the first rays of sunlight broke over the mountains, Rachel turned back toward the church. There was still work to be done. The sky over Shadow Creek was painted in fiery hues of orange and red as the sun rose, a sharp contrast to the battle-worn town below. Rachel stood at the edge of the church's bell tower, her gaze sweeping over the streets. Smoke still rose from the smoldering ruins of the cartel's safe house on the outskirts of town, a grim testament to the fight they'd just endured. Below her, the town was beginning to stir. Residents ventured cautiously from their homes, their faces a mixture of fear, relief, and determination. The cartel had tried to break Shadow Creek, but the town had held its ground. Rachel's radio crackled. "Morrison, you there?" It was Martinez. Rachel keyed her mic. "I'm here." "What's the status?" "The deputies are rounding up stragglers," Martinez reported. "We've got a few cartel members in custody, but most of them are either dead or gone. The reinforcements pulled back after we took out the safe house." Rachel nodded to herself. "And the civilians?" "Safe for now," Martinez said. "But they're scared. Can't blame them after what they've been through." Rachel's jaw tightened. "Neither can I." In the church basement, the team gathered for what felt like the first moment of calm in days. Maria handed out cups of coffee, her hands still shaking from the adrenaline of the past night. "We did it," Carlos said, his voice filled with cautious hope. "We actually did it." Rachel leaned against the table, her arms crossed. "We won the battle," she said. "But the war's far from over. The cartel won't let this go unanswered. We've taken out one link in the chain, but the rest of it is still out there." Victor, seated in the corner with his arms folded, spoke up. "She's right. The surgeon might be dead, but his bosses are going to notice the mess we've made. They'll send someone worse to clean it up." Martinez frowned. "Worse than the surgeon?" Victor nodded. "Trust me, they've got people who make him look like an amateur." A heavy silence settled over the room. "So what do we do?" Maria asked, her voice trembling slightly. Rachel looked around the room, her gaze steady. "We get ahead of them. Everything we pulled from that safe house, names, locations, accounts, it's all evidence. We take it to the right people, expose their entire operation." "And then what?" Johnson asked. "Then we take the fight to them," Rachel said. Later that afternoon, Rachel sat with Martinez and Victor in the makeshift command center. The files they'd recovered from the safe house were spread out before them, a web of connections and operations spanning multiple states and even countries. "This is bigger than we thought," Martinez said, scanning the documents. "They've got assets everywhere, warehouses, airstrips, even a shipping company on the coast." Rachel tapped a location on the map. "This is their next staging area. If we hit it before they regroup, we can cut them off at the knees." Victor raised an eyebrow. "You're planning another assault? You do realize how thin we're stretched, right?" Rachel met his gaze. "You said it yourself. If we don't keep the pressure on, they'll come back stronger. We can't let that happen." Victor leaned back in his chair, a faint smirk on his lips. "You really don't know when to quit, do you?" "No," Rachel said. "And that's why we're going to win." As night fell, Rachel walked through the quiet streets of Shadow Creek, her thoughts heavy. The fight against the cartel had taken its toll on the town, on her team, and on herself. She passed by the diner, its neon sign flickering faintly, and saw Maria inside, wiping down tables. Despite everything, Maria managed a small wave when she saw Rachel. Rachel nodded in return, feeling a flicker of something she hadn't felt in a long time: hope. Back at the church, Rachel stood outside, staring up at the stars. The cool desert air carried a faint scent of sage and dust, a reminder of the land's enduring resilience. Victor joined her, his footsteps quiet. "Long night?" he asked. Rachel didn't look at him. "They're all long." Victor leaned against the railing. "You did good here. Saved a lot of lives." Rachel glanced at him, her expression unreadable. "It's not about what we did. It's about what comes next." Victor nodded slowly. "What has come next?" Rachel's gaze returned to the horizon. "We take this fight to them. No more waiting for them to come to us. No more reacting. We dismantle their network piece by piece, no matter how long it takes." Victor smirked. "You've got a hell of a vendetta, Morrison." Rachel's expression hardened. "It's not a vendetta. It's justice." The next morning, Rachel gathered the team in the church. Deputies, volunteers, and civilians who had helped in the fight stood shoulder to shoulder, their faces worn but resolute. "Shadow Creek stood its ground," Rachel said, her voice carrying through the room. "We proved that we're stronger together than they ever expected. But this isn't just about Shadow Creek. It's about every town, every family they've targeted." She paused, letting her words sink in. "They think they can operate in the shadows, hiding behind fear and corruption. They think no one will fight back. But they're wrong. We've already shown them that." The room was silent, every face turned toward her. "This is our line in the sand," Rachel continued, "and we're not moving." As the team dispersed, Rachel stood by the door, watching them go. Martinez stopped beside her, her badge glinting in the sunlight. "You think we can really do this?" Martinez asked. Rachel's eyes were steady. "We don't have a choice." In the distance, the sun rose higher, its light washing over the town. Shadow Creek had weathered the storm, but Rachel knew the fight was far from over. She tightened her grip on the map in her hand, her mind already racing with plans for the next battle. The cartel had underestimated her once. They wouldn't get the chance to do it again.